Good afternoon and welcome back to the 21st Annual CERIAS Security Symposium. I'm Joel Rasmus, Managing Director of CERIAS, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Matt Mickelson is a Principal Strategist with MITRE Corporation, a proud CERIAS partner, and his talk on how AI is changing cyber and why you should change everything you're doing, just not the way you think. Matt, welcome.
Thank you. Let's get the share my screen.
And as you're doing that, I would remind all of the attendees that please ask questions through the Slack channel, and we'll address those at the end of the talk.
All right, do you see the slides?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so my name is Matt Mickelson. As promised, I work for MITRE Corporation. Before we get going, a little bit about MITRE. MITRE is a nonprofit that works almost exclusively, exclusively with government. MITRE is a holder of 7 different federally funded research and development centers across a number of different federal agencies and groups. MITRE does not sell product, so you will not hear me pitch anything product related because we don't do that. MITRE offers unbiased research for the government, unbiased because we are not commercial and we are not tainted by product sales or delivery. So if you're interested in more in what MITRE does, or if you're unfamiliar with MITRE, I'll have some slides at the end to point you in the right direction. You can always ask me after the talk as well. To get us started, this is actually a slide I did not have in last night, but as I was hearing folks talk, I wanted to underscore what's interesting to me about working for MITRE, particularly on the government side in cyber. This is actually a little bit dated. There are some new statistics from 2020 out of the Verizon data breach. However, in the interactive tool has up through 2017, and this is a much prettier depiction of data breaches, data incidents across various industries. The big bar there you will see is the public sector. So if there is one area that adversaries are really going after, it is the government. And so I see and have seen a lot of cyber activity. The cyber activity is pretty fun if you get into cyber. Cyber on the public side, there is a lot of activity there, and it's what gets us going. So with that said, I'll get into the gist of the talk and probably why you're here if you read the title. AI is definitely affecting how we use technology. It's changed a lot of things. It's given us a way to model what were previously impractical systems, things that relied on behavior, vision, video, political markets, social markets, language, all these things that were very difficult for conventional systems to model are now seeing a rise in a new world of being able to predict, model, and describe with AI. As you might imagine, AI is also affecting how we abuse the technology. It's reduced the cost of constructing cyber attacks and constructing cyber weapons. It's automated human activity. It has removed the human from the loop in a lot of cases. It's created new threats or threats that were previously impractical due to time constraints or financial constraints. It's enabled exquisitely fine targeting in terms of classification. Things that were not really practical on a large scale and being able to filter out down to specific individuals or specific geographic regions are now much easier with the use of AI and machine learning. And it's proven its ability to scale to non-deterministic systems, which is the really big thing that kind of sets it apart from yesterday's models. Over here on the right side of the screen, you'll see a few examples that I pulled. The first was, you probably saw this article. There was an artist who actually lugged around 99 phones and faked and manipulated a traffic jam on Google Maps. The second one is Burger King's television ad that triggered Google Home devices. And the last one was students that figured out that their tests were being graded by AI and how to cheat the algorithm. The interesting thing here was that he just started posting a couple sentences and then just a laundry list of keywords that happened to trigger the algorithm, and got 100% on pretty much all of his essays from there on out. So these are all different ways that the AI fails, or how AI is actually abusing the tech. We're using AI to abuse the technology. So before we really get into the cyber, I wanna hammer down a few things before we get started. The first thing is that everything that's already in the world when you're born is really normal. You don't really think about how people that could have possibly existed without it. Anything that's invented between when you're born and when you're 30 is exciting and it's creative, and you go to get a job in it, you learn it, you figure out ways to manipulate it to do really interesting things. And then everything else that gets invented after you're 30 is the beginning of the end of civilization as you know it. At least per Douglas Adams, who did the Hitchhiker's Guide. The second thing I'd like to hammer in before we really get started is that this isn't what cyber looks like. This might be what cyber looked like a long, long time ago, but it's not what it looks like today. And it's certainly not what it's looked like for a long time. This is really what cyber looks like. This is actually a picture from the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge, which is now almost 5 years old now. It's a bunch of machines that are communicating with each other. There's no human in the picture. It's communication over the internet, and it's data. It's a bunch of ones and zeros. And the quote down here, that interactive cyber is obsolete, is basically where we are today. Cyber is taking place at the speed of the internet, at the speed that servers talk to each other, and it's increasingly happening without a human anywhere in the process. If you're not familiar, the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge was essentially a challenge to create systems that could autonomously find flaws, find vulnerabilities in opposing systems, automatically generate exploits for said vulnerabilities, and automatically launch attacks, all the while automatically and autonomously patching your own system and scoring points through the process. The last thing, or one of the last things that I'd like to point out, just to kind of motivate, if you're not, or if you're here, you probably are already on the bandwagon of why cyber is important. But if you still don't believe me, this was a Crowdstrike report from about a year ago, well, about a year and a half ago at this point, where they looked at the top 5 advanced persistent threats. So you have the top 5 APTs that they looked at and how long it actually took them to launch their attacks. The top one up there, the number 1 at Russia at the top, is 18 minutes and 49 seconds. That's the time you have from when they hit go to when your crown jewels leave your organization. That's 18 minutes and 49 seconds. Their recommendation as a result of that was that organizations really needed to be able to detect cyber intrusions and cyber attacks within 1 minute, completely isolate them within 10, and remediate them within 60. And at this point, if you're thinking to yourself that you're not even measuring in the right units at this point, you're with everybody else. Because very few companies, very few organizations are able to detect that quickly and isolate systems that quickly. It's just happening fast, and it's happening fast partially because of AI and partially because of the automation that's occurring in the system. Okay, so what's actually been changing? Well, a few things. One of the things that we learned, or a few of the things that we learned from the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge, is that AI makes mistakes. AI is a very probabilistic engine in its internal core. It is probabilistic, and no matter how good it is, it will always have a false positive rate. There's one guarantee for an AI system, and that's that it's going to be wrong at some point. It's also going to produce ambiguous results, right? Because we don't really know. With a fully trained model, we're taking the results of that system as its recommendations and as its classification, and you don't really know whether it's good or bad. And we're going to explore that a little bit more in some later slides. It's also dual use, and when I say dual use, I mean both offensive and defensive. but also that generates an arms race, right? So as soon as an attacker or an adversary employs AI cyber tools against you, they've escalated the timescale in which you need to respond, which forces you to, further take the human out of the loop and employ AI on the defense side, which generates a game theoretic arms race where all sides have to up the ante and start using faster and faster AI. And the last thing that we learned is that it creates accreditation issues. Because of that arms race and because of that speed and the use on both the offensive and the defensive sides, we'll talk a little bit later on about some of the accreditation issues that presents. So first, talk about some of the ambiguous results and the mistakes that AI makes. I'll start from the left and kind of move my way to the right. We've already seen, and these examples are now years old, so hopefully most folks have encountered these at this point. On the far left, you have the stop sign that has been doctored so that the AI classifiers, the machine computer vision algorithms, will see the stop sign not as a stop sign, but as a speed limit sign. And if you're a car, that could be catastrophic for a pedestrian. The next one over is the multicolored circle, which will trick the computer vision algorithms to classifying anything with that sticker on it into a toaster. Below that, we have what I call the ill-trained models. In this particular case, it's going to go nameless, but essentially this was a time series algorithm that was attempting to predict what was going to happen a few steps out in the time series. Think of this as like trying to predict the stock market. And what the AI actually learned from the model was not the intrinsic behaviors, but as it was minimizing the distance between its prediction and the actual result, it figured out that if it was just off by 1, it would generate a really, really close graph. And it does. One of those graphs, they're almost so close together you can't really see them on the slide here, but the red one and the black one minimize the distance between each other really well. The problem is if there's a precipitous drop in the stock market or the time series data that this is generated on, it's going to be catastrophic because you're not actually doing any prediction of results. It's just simply giving you yesterday's value as a prediction for tomorrow's value. The other problem that AI has currently is the false positives, which again, we're going to dive into in a little bit more detail again later. This one is kind of cute. It's one of my favorites. It's actually a really interesting test set for computer vision, which is blueberry muffin or chihuahua. And it becomes really, part of what makes this cute and funny is it's really hard to tell some of these, tell the difference between whether the picture is a chihuahua or a blueberry muffin. The swan below it, or the Canadian goose below it, obviously there's a clear mistake there where the classifier is picking up on something in the water and calling it a car. And then you've got all the various levels of unanticipated behavior. We talked about the Burger King television ad to activate the Google Home devices, but these two in black text here were AIs that were generated to look at actual computer code. And it figured out, so in the top box here, we've got an AI algorithm that was trying to prove essentially to verify that the output of this program against the trusted output of the known golden standard. And what it figured out was that it could always get things to match if it just deleted the trusted output so that it was empty and then output nothing all the time, because the null set will always match the null set. And that's how it fixed the problem. And it gave you a completely false sense of security that your output matched the trusted output all the time. So these are the kind of things that we're used to seeing, and these are the kind of things that we're going to learn to avoid in some later slides. Moving on to the issue of dual use, cyber, when I work with my colleagues on the DoD side, they talk in terms of terrain and weapons. Cyber is the only domain where it's impossible to tell the difference between the weapon and the terrain. in the air, in the water, on the land. It's usually very easy to tell the weapon apart from the mountain behind you, or the hill behind you, or the grass behind you. Not so in cyber. You really can't tell the difference between a piece of malicious offensive code and a regular program without a lot of insight. So what I'm trying to depict in this picture here is obviously both the dual use nature of, is this camouflage being done for offensive purposes because you're trying to sneak up on someone? Or is it being done for defensive purposes because you're trying to hide it from your adversary? But also because it's become very difficult to tell the weapon from the terrain. Moving on to those accreditation issues that I talked about a minute ago. So with the race condition and the arms race between the offensive and the defensive side that's presented by the speed at which AI can identify vulnerabilities and auto-generate exploits for them, it's becoming less and less safe to keep the human in the system, right? Some people would argue that if you're being attacked by AI that can automatically detect vulnerabilities and create bespoke exploits for them, you need to be able to adapt your system in real time, or else you're going to fall prey to the new AI offensive tools. However, if you talk to anybody that's actually run a network or run a large organization, it's not safe to let the system just change itself. We have accreditations, we have certifications for a reason, and we need to know that, and we need to be able to trust this system and the platform that we have deployed in a production environment, especially if it's doing more than just protecting data. If it's a cyber physical system that is carrying people, or if it's a weapon system that could hurt people, it becomes all the more important. So we get ourselves in this catch-22 of how do we deal with a human out of the loop when we need to keep the human in the loop. More on that later. So how do we deal with all this AI now that is pervading our cyber and our tools? So there are a few things that are happening today. One of which is to go back to determinism, right? So we have these autonomous systems and they're providing a lot of value, but the deterministic systems are important too. And we're starting to see that the deterministic systems actually improve the autonomous systems and vice versa. And so putting them in a feedback loop allows the autonomous system to give some insight to a rules-based system and maybe provided additional heuristics that it didn't know before. And it gives the heuristics-based system, or the heuristics-based system will produce some things that the autonomous system, some additional rules for it to train on a little better the next time. And we can go around and around this loop, and we actually find that putting an AI, a machine learning, or a probabilistic system in concert in a feedback loop with a heuristics-based or rules-based system, we actually get something better. Why? Because our most valuable models are actually the ones that we can test ourselves, that we can verify, that are understandable, they're easy to debug, and they're clear when things go wrong, right? Not always the case with AI. In the untestable design category, I'm going to harken back almost 10 years to the Toyota unintended acceleration debacle. And it all comes down to, can you actually tell when there's a mistake? And how do you validate against ground truth? The problem with non-deterministic systems like human beings, like cars, and like complex software is that they quickly become untestable. The NASA team that was brought in to actually analyze what happened in the Toyota unintended acceleration incidents ultimately found that the Toyota software was untestable. That being that even if you put a million miles of testing on these vehicles before you release them, it's still not good enough. You have not hit all of the cases that you need to hit if you have millions of cars on the road and you're driving them for millions of miles at a time. The next is, how do you know when you're making a mistake? So once you've trained an AI algorithm, once you have an AI model, and you flip the switch and you move that model into predictive mode, where it is now making predictions or classifications after its training, you've basically abdicated and said at that point that everything that this model now produces is going to be taken as as fact. And so what do? You need something outside of the AI model, namely a deterministic system, to help give you some context of when that prediction is not necessarily correct, right? I actually found it a little bit ironic that when I put this picture in the presentation that Microsoft has this nice feature that will automatically generate alt text for you. And it said that this was a picture containing indoor. And I thought that this was absolutely apropos because this is exactly what I'm talking about as needing some other out-of-band method to actually tell you when your AI algorithm might not be making the correct prediction. The next thing is you absolutely need to have ground truth. We probably all have seen or read articles about AI that is making predictions or making classifications on things that can never be validated. It is one thing to tell me a prediction for the winner of the next Super Bowl, assuming that there will be a next Super Bowl, because at the end of the Super Bowl, there will be a winner and you will be able to validate your prediction is true or if it's false. But if you're trying to analyze this adorable face and tell me if it's actually a good dog or a bad dog, you will never actually know the answer to that question. So there are a lot of AI algorithms out there that are doing things akin to facial recognition or trying to determine good versus bad something when you will never really absolutely know ground truth. And that is quickly becoming a big problem in industry for AI models. Next is you have a whole class of problems that are undecidable, and I see this one every day. There are a lot of organizations that succumb to the hubris of using math and analysis and models as thinking that they have optimized to the best answer, when in a lot of cases, not only is it not necessarily the best answer, there might not even be a best answer. The cute little example here is on Conway's Game of Life. Conway, who unfortunately passed away this year, created the Game of Life, which starts you with a pattern and then imposes very few rules on the system of how you create new black dots and how you take black dots back away in successive generations to produce interesting patterns. The interesting thing that the Game of Life showed us was that given an initial pattern and a later pattern, it's mathematically impossible. There is no algorithm that can tell you whether one pattern is ever generated from another pattern. So there are many, many cases like this that arise in real life where there just isn't a best answer. And AI is quickly touting itself as giving you a best answer. And a lot of folks are psychologically, human beings have the psychological need or the desire to believe the math and the analytics as believable. And it can very quickly give us a false sense of security into thinking that we have a best answer when there's not even such a thing. Next, we have the infamous rare event. I can't tell you how many folks that I've talked to who are like, yeah, Matt, but my team, they're really smart analytical folks. They've built this thing and the false positive rate on this algorithm is near zero. And my response is usually, well, how close to zero is it? Because even a 1 in a million chance is still not enough if you have a lot of samples, right? The case in question that I've put on this slide, the odds of winning Powerball are about 1 in 300 million, right? The actual statistic is up here. And I'm talking about the grand prize, the actual jackpot of Powerball. And the problem with that is that seems like an astronomically small number, right? However, if you have enough people playing, rare events happen all the time. In fact, in 2016, when the Powerball jackpot grew to $1.6 billion, there were 3 people that ultimately had to split that jackpot. So why are we doing this? It sounds like I'm kind of tearing down the straw man before I've even fully built it up. So why are we even doing this? Well, the reason why we do this is because, one, it sounds like reality is always going to win. And it turns out reality always does win. This is a cute little example for the physics and the science folks. Here's an example, it's called Norton's Dome, of something that obeys all of Newton's laws. So it obeys very, very strict rules. However, it turns out it's metastable and non-deterministic. And the way that this works is there's a nice long proof of it, but in essence, it goes something like this. Newton's laws are reversible in time. So anything that goes forward in time is reversible, and you can play it backwards. So you actually start with this ball at the bottom of the hill, and you flick it with your finger with just the exquisite amount of force so that it rolls up the hill and then it stops perfectly still, balanced perfectly at the top of the hill. Now, because everything is reversible, if you look at it backwards, right, where you start with the ball sitting precariously balanced at the top of the hill, it can roll down the hill and it is completely random which direction it starts to roll. And that's because if you worked it in reverse, you could have flicked the ball from any point down on the bottom and gotten it to land up at the top. So here's a really good example of how reality will always beat us, even if we think we have a good model to model it. All right, so we do this because not all deterministic models are practical. Even though the determinism gets us testability and easy to understand it, sometimes they're just not practical. What's up here right now is a great example of the Lorentz equations. You may be more familiar with it as the butterfly effect. You've got 3 differential equations, already not necessarily terribly practical once we've distilled it into 3 differential equations. But what makes this one so terribly bad is that even the slightest modification of the initial conditions will send off wildly different results much, much later in time. We also don't do it because things are just too complex, right? So when the environment or the thing that you're trying to model is just so excessively complex, it becomes increasingly difficult for a deterministic model to even be viable, which is why you're seeing a lot of early successes in AI and machine learning on things that are traditionally too complex for computers of yore to handle. Things like recognizing handwritten speech, or analyzing video, or object detection in a video. Those things were way too complex for deterministic models to handle. Or there's just too much uncertainty. If you can't figure out the signal from the noise, right? If it all looks like noise and it's just if it's overwhelmed by randomness, you can't really model what you can't understand. And so that's where we've leaned on AI and machine learning. All right, so we've been fairly philosophical. I'm going to try to tell you some things that we can actually do to get out of this problem. So I spend most of my days, truth in advertising at MITRE, working with the Office of Naval Research. So my day job is really helping coordinate and direct a large amount of research that the Navy puts into cyber. So the first thing we need to do to get ourselves out of this problem or deal with the new challenges of AI and cyber is to find the appropriate level of meaningful human control. This is actually a loaded term in the autonomy world, this notion of meaningful human control. And what it gets down to is, if you're going to put a human in the loop, on the continuum of having the human in the loop and having the human completely removed, it's very context dependent. For example, I'm much more likely to let my Roomba roam around my house without having a human involved because it's not likely to damage anything than I would be to have a completely driverless car with no steering wheel, at least today. And the reason it all comes down to how much the mistakes cost, right? If the mistake costs you an ad buy or it costs you a microtransaction, that's one thing. But if the mistake costs human lives or health and safety, then it's a completely different situation. Over here is a cute little XKCD cartoon. I've seen a few of the XKCD cartoons come up in the slideshow that's actually going on, so I'm glad other people are reading XKCD. This is cutely formed as like a CAPTCHA. To complete your registration, please tell us whether or not the image contains a stop sign. Please be quick because our car is approaching the intersection. This is just an underscore. It's a humorous way to basically say we need to figure out where the human goes in the system. If you are the CEO or you are the risk owner of your organization, you have some pretty hefty decisions when it comes to cyber as to where you want the human in the loop in the decision-making process for cyber defense and as the offense is ratcheted up. Because we've already talked about the fact that AI makes mistakes and you can't just let your system evolve itself. The next thing we need to do is really get back to basics, right? This sounds harder than it is, right? It's really easy to say, well, just get back to basics, but I'm going to show you some things that are happening. We need to get back and reduce the attack surfaces. As commercial industry is incentivized to churn out code, companies are incentivized to deliver one-size-fits-all code. Why would they send 100 different versions of the same piece of software to 100 different people when they could send and deliver one piece of software that works for everybody? So the attack surfaces on most commercial software and most software in general have gotten bigger and bigger. I probably don't need to, in this crowd, tell you that that's happening, but software is getting bloated every day and it's getting worse and it's not going to change. Developers also are not incentivized to deliver debloated code either, because developers have to deliver code as fast as possible, which forces them to include large amounts of libraries, even if they just want one function. So, the developers who are building the software are not going to create a function from scratch when they can just call a library that has everything in it that they need. The result is there's a lot in that library and there's a lot in that code that goes unused or unneeded. The second thing, which I have labeled under reuse in this recycling metaphor, is diversifying what we have. So if an adversary has a 0 day and they have an exploit for this 0 day, what would happen if you had a tool to actually change the code that you have so that it's functionally equivalent, but everything in memory and everything is different from the attacker's perspective? And that's what I'm talking about when I say diversify. And I'll talk in a little bit about some tools that enable you to do this, but they'll give you entire equivalence classes of code that are otherwise functionally equivalent, but now look different to the adversary. So now the adversary can't just lean on their 0 day or their exploit that they know works. They're going to have to develop a unique exploit for each diversified version of the code that you happen to be running. And the last one under recycle is what DoD labels as maneuver. And that's basically, how do you change your architecture faster than your cyber adversary can actually develop exploits for it? So even if you do have exploits, which we're never going to have a perfectly secure system, can we maneuver it faster than the cyber adversary can actually figure out what we have and where the vulnerabilities are? Akin to, we know that we have some doors and windows open, but we're going to move them around so that even if you know that there's an open window somewhere, it's constantly moving. The idea here is to cost the adversary time, change everything in the time that you just bought yourself, and then rinse and repeat over and over and over again. And hence the title of, you need to change everything that you're doing, and you need to keep changing it and keep changing it. And there are now ways to do this without really mucking up the accreditation of your system. Okay, so why reduce the attack surface? If you don't believe me or you don't buy in to this concept, the first steps of any decent security guide are going to tell you to remove all the services that you don't need, remove all the packages that you're not going to use, and go through and take away all the default administrator accounts, change all the passwords, and eliminate any unnecessary privileges that you don't need. If you've ever done this exercise, you know that it is excessively hard and you don't get them all. The little picture here of guys standing on the forklift is fun, but the bigger picture of the forklift on a forklift on a forklift is even more fun. This becomes really hard if you're using commercial code because you don't always get the ability to remove services from the code that you have, you don't always have access to the source code that was provided for the executable that you have. However, there's a new suite of tools that I'm here to tell you exists, because I see them in my day job through the Office of Naval Research, that is emerging. There's an entire community in the cyber research world that is developing now all of these tools that enable you to make transformations on the executable itself without access to the source code, to actually customize that software and remove features that you either don't need, don't use, or don't want. The state of the art, as I've already alluded to, is this notion of binary transformation. Being able to take the actual binary after it's been compiled from source and remove unnecessary features, debloat, trim unused code and libraries that you don't need or don't want or aren't used, and then further diversify it. So once you have a hardened piece of code where you've reduced the attack surface, you can now create diversified variants literally by the thousands that are functionally equivalent but look different to an attacker. And then the last step is perhaps the most important step of being able to verify and validate that you do in fact have equivalence classes to satisfy the need that you're going to actually put this in a production environment, and it can't be different, right? It's going to cost you money. It's going to cost somebody health and safety. It might cost lives in some cases. So you need the verification that it is indeed functionally, mathematically equivalent to what you transformed in the first place. The initial results on this are actually pretty astounding. As you might imagine, if I've set up this straw man correctly, you would believe that there's a lot of unused and unnecessary code just hanging around in some of the libraries that the developers are including. And our initial results on Java actually bear that out. Some of the reductions we're getting about 50% reduction in just removing dead code and unused code that doesn't execute in the program. And if you're Java and you drag along a runtime environment, we can see up to 80–85% reduction of a Java runtime environment with absolutely no impact to what the code is supposed to be doing according to its test scripts. The initial results on BIOS images is even better. And the reason why is that the BIOS that runs on your hardware and your firmware is designed to be backwards compatible all the way back in most cases to 286 processors and before. And if you see this sort of Russian nesting doll encapsulated software within software within software, there's a lot of stuff in the BIOS that's just not needed anymore. And we're seeing reductions in the BIOS, which by the way sits underneath your operating system. And if you have an exploit that gets into the BIOS, that is very much game over. We're seeing the reduction up in the 75–80% range. The diversified piece, we like to refer to this as a melt, stir, refreeze cycle. I have a cute little not an infographic because these are real files, but these are representative of the rainbow of colors of the original file on the far left, and then the diversified variants of it on the far right. Depicted are 4 variants of the original file shuffled around in memory to create 4 new executables, which are functionally equivalent to each other, but look different to the attacker, right? If you were an attacker and you knew there was a vulnerability and you had an exploit, more specifically, you had an exploit chain of things that would give you control of the system, what works in that original binary is no longer guaranteed to work in any of those variants. And it does this by a partial decompilation to what's called an intermediate representation of the code, shuffling that, and then recompiling back to something that will execute on the system again. If you can create these thousands at a time, it not only gives you resilience and a little bit of deterrence, because if your adversary even knows that you're doing this, it may be enough to deter them from launching an attack, but it also gives you the ability to do what's called moving target defense and actually swapping these out. So if this works, you can actually rotate these like you rotate cryptographic keys or like you frequency hop in radio communications. And the goal here is obviously to adapt and change things faster than your adversary can keep up. You can't we'll go back to this over and over again. You can't make a perfectly secure system, but you can change things faster than your adversary can adapt. The last one we're going to hammer on here is the notion that I included in the title of the talk, which is just to change everything and change it and keep changing it and keep changing it. I have this QT thing that's not cyber, right? This was actually from real research, linguistic research. And originally they thought that they're like, oh, you know what, you can actually change up the letters and all these words and it doesn't mess up the content. The person can still read it. And they can still read it. But the important part from a cyber perspective is that when you change everything up, you can have a functionally equivalent piece of code, but there's a slowdown. There's an impact to your adversary. The linguistics research showed that there's actually an 11% slowdown when people actually read the words. So they get all the content, but it takes them longer. And the idea here is just what we've been hammering on before. You can't necessarily keep your adversary out, but our goal is to impose as much additional cost on them, which is also going to take them time. And that's time in which we can change everything yet again. And we can just increase this cycle. So this is a brave new world for cyber. They're really interesting things. These are all attack agnostic tools that can be used on cyber. It doesn't matter what the adversary is going to bring to the table. These will work because what you're doing is you're actually literally changing things up on the adversary all the time. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to put up the canonical MITRE slide here. I will announce, because everybody else has been announcing it, MITRE is obviously hiring. We are looking for good interns. We are looking for full-time staff. And if you have any questions about MITRE, who MITRE is, what we do, what makes us tick, you can go to mitre.org and you can look up. There's more information on there than you will really want, including all of the recruiting and the hiring requisitions. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. We did get a number of questions that came in while you were talking, and so let's just walk right through them. So the first question came in very early during your talk when you were identifying the bear and the kitten. And so if 18 minutes is state of the practice, what does it mean to get left of bang for a non-offensive organization? Response by itself seems like a losing game period.
I would say that the CrowdStrike recommendation, that's part of why they recommended the 1-10-60 approach, was because if an adversary can be in and out of your system with the crown jewels in 18 minutes, you absolutely have to be able to detect within 1 minute, isolate it within 10 minutes, and have it completely remediated within 60. Obviously, CrowdStrike sells cybersecurity services, so it's a little bit biased, but I wouldn't disagree with that. You obviously need to get left of bang by moving faster and responding more quickly. But what I wanted to get to by the end of the talk were some methods and some new cyber capabilities, which hopefully you may not be aware of, that enable you to get left of bang and get out of the incident response cycle and get back to those first principles of just hardening your network so you have less to respond to. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
I think you did a good job with that question. Yeah, absolutely. A second question came in that of a attendee asking, are there any publicly available cyber modules similar to NEATS by chance?
Navy Electricity and Electronics Training Series. I'll be honest, I have not taken the training series, so I am not an expert. While I do work with the Navy, I'm not familiar with everything that they do. Publicly available cyber modules, I will say many of the research products that have come out of the program that in fact created a lot of what I was talking about there at the end of the talk are publicly available. In fact, I would be remiss to overlook the fact that ONR and MITRE and Purdue actually had a joint summer series this summer that produced 8 tools that now live in virtual machines that are very easy to just download and get started with. If you're interested in transforming binaries yourself or experimenting to see how this would work on some of the binaries, there are at least 8 tools that are already ready and have already been taught in some cases and disseminated and easy to install.
And I believe those will be available off of the CERIAS website here in the next few days.
I was going to let you take that one.
By the way, that was part of my wrap up, is thanking MITRE for being part of this thing that we're on there. So you just shortened my finish here. There were a few more questions. One of our students asked, and I know he's one of the students because he sits on our leadership board, our student leadership board. When do you see the advanced binary transformation software coming to the commercial space?
Any prediction I would have is going to be wrong. I would love to see it as fast as possible, right? I think I have seen some small emerging businesses already start to deliver things in the software diversification world. I have already started to see some of these concepts hit the market. So I'm really hoping that these hit tomorrow. You can play with these tools today. Are they shrink wrapped like a commercial product that you would get from Silicon Valley? No, they're not shrink wrapped yet. But the advantage is there's still a lot of malleability in some of those tools where if you want to explore how they work on things in your organization, you can do that with the tools and you can take them in any direction that you see fit. Can you buy something that is just turnkey and fits? Not yet today, but hopefully in the next 5 years.
I agree with that. I don't think there's anything readily available, but I don't think it's not a long time before we start seeing those come out. I don't know how good they will be when they first hit the market, though.
I would say they are not out yet, but they are definitely within reach. So if you work at an organization that has an appetite to take some things that are out there that are within reach and do some light application to your own internal use cases, you could get started today. If you want to wait for the vendor community to catch up so that you can just buy something from someone else, you're going to wait a bit longer, but that's true of every industry.
Greg Shannon, a Purdue CS PhD, by the way, who is on the leadership team of the new Symantec Institute. That's the new DOE Institute for Cybersecurity of Energy Efficient Advanced Manufacturing, had several questions. And again, on the topic of binary transformations, he goes, how do you find unintended consequences in binary transformations, especially for real-time systems, proofs?
Mm-hmm. So there's a whole class of tools that are coming out of that Office of Naval Research program. If you remember the slide that I had up that had basically 4 components, the last component is the verification validation of your transformation. Most of those tools are in the formal verification realm, and they use theorem provers that will give you mathematical certainty, if they can, that the certain property of the original binary still holds in the transformed binary. So they'll give you essentially a mathematical guarantee, given that you are proving the right theorems and you're looking at the right properties and that you have all of the necessary properties covered, those tools will actually give you a mathematical guarantee. The kink is obviously in the implementation and the guarantee that you have perfectly exquisite test cases that cover everything that you need. But the tools will give you a mathematical guarantee.
And kind of a follow-up to that, again, from Greg, are there proofs as to the degree of diversity provided, such as the number of bits and the extent entropy?
Yep. So the slide that I had up with a picture of the rainbow colors of the diversified pieces of code, that tool will actually give you a metric or a measure of how many bits moved, how many basic blocks moved, and without without going all the way down into the weeds, because I'm not sure of the level of technical depth of everybody in the audience, they will tell you how many things stayed static, how many things moved, and they'll give you that pretty color chart to actually show you pictorially the difference between the transformations. So there are measures of effectiveness, there are metrics for diversity on each of those tools.
So there was more of a comment that on mutation of defenses instead of offense, but I found interesting that the thought of self-modifying computer viruses, which we're obviously already seeing.
Yep. So as with anything, in fact, I had it on a couple slides, right? Any tool in cyber can be used for offense and for defense. It's almost one of the guarantees of cyber. The mutation of your code and your attack surface is fantastic for defense. It's also fantastic for offense. And this is where it gets into that arms race I talked about earlier. One of the best things that defense can do is maneuver its attack surface, right? So even if you don't know where all your vulnerabilities are, if you're mutating and you're changing your attack surface and you're maneuvering it faster than the offensive tool can do it, even if you're doing it at exactly the same speed as the offensive tool, you've now at least kept up in the arms race while getting yourself out of the incident response cycle. And the incident response cycle is very costly, both in terms of human time, human hours, and the dollars that it takes to have those responders respond. So the more we can do to get us out of that response cycle and keep the adversary in their development cycle, the better off we as defenders are.
Matt, that is the extent of the questions that came in through the Slack channel. Again, attendees, Matt probably will be jumping into that channel when we're done here if you want to ask questions directly. But with that, I want to thank Matt and MITRE for the talk today, as well as the collaboration over the last few years, both on some projects that we can talk about, some we can't, but specifically all of the O&R work that ended up being this, the S4, the Software Security Summer School that was just hosted last month. So look forward to working with you and your team in this academic year as well. And with that, we wrap up today's day one of the 21st Annual CERIAS Security Symposium.